Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our redistricting conversation with Dr. Alex Keena, who is an assistant professor of political science at VCU, who researches political representation. He's also co-author of Gerrymandering the States, Partisanship, Race, and the Transformation of American Federalism, and Gerrymandering in America, the House of Representatives, the Supreme Court, and the Future of Popular Sovereignty, and many other articles on redistricting, money, and politics, and the US Congress. Before joining VCU, he was a visiting professor at the University of North Florida and at the University of Richmond. So, Alex, welcome to our conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here and talk with you all.
Excellent, excellent. So our first question for you is, what is redistricting?
So redistricting is where the geographic boundaries, either at the federal, state, or local level, are redrawn. The simplest explanation that I can think of for most normal people, as in not academic people, is when they reshuffle the school district lines to meet a variety of purposes. But for our purposes today, what's most important for us is redistricting that occurs at the state legislative level. So in Virginia, we have 100 seats in the House of Delegates, and those seats are assigned to 100 separate districts across the Commonwealth. And how you basically draw them, there's a number of criteria that go into how you draw them. But the idea is that each district is a community and that each community has a member, a delegate that is elected.
So what has the US Supreme Court said about redistricting?
So it's really, really complicated. 100 years ago, or even 60 years ago, the Supreme Court had a hands-off approach on anything related to redistricting. And, in the 1950s, before the 1960s, the district lines were drawn in a way to prevent certain political parties or certain types of voters, or even certain voters of certain races or ethnicities from voting. One of the things that happened in like the 1940s and 50s was that some states would have like districts in urban areas that had like 1 million people, and then next door there'd be a district that had like less than 100,000 people. And so it literally gave some voters more power than other voters. And the Supreme Court at first was like, we can't really do anything about this because the Supreme Court doesn't like to get involved in issues that can be settled by elections. And so the Supreme Court said, if you want to solve this problem, go and vote. But of course, that's like a catch-22, because if your voting power is abused and you have to go to vote in order to find a solution, it doesn't really make any sense. So in the 1960s, the court was like, actually, we can address this problem of redistricting. Redistricting is an issue that the courts can tackle. So the 1960s was a really, really important time because the courts interpreted the law in a way that made very strict rules that the government has to follow when drawing district lines. And one of those rules was every district has to have the same number of people. So you can't like dilute the voting rights of some people based on how you draw the district lines. And for a long time, everything was pretty much okay. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago that the court started to sort of step back and say, well, actually, maybe redistricting is a political issue and that we shouldn't be getting involved. And it's actually quite confusing to try to rationalize or explain how the court has changed over the last 60 years. That was actually one of the midterm questions I had in one of my classes last week. And it's really, really complicated. Essentially, right now, it just comes down to who is on the Supreme Court. And it just so happens that one party got to appoint 3 people, and then the other party got to appoint 6 people. And the 6 people see the issue very differently. And so right now, the Supreme Court will tackle certain redistricting cases. Like if it has to do with like race, then the Supreme Court says it's okay for the courts to be involved. But if it has to do with like politics, like gerrymandering, the court says that they can't be involved. You have to go and vote in order to solve that issue.
So the voters in Virginia decided not too long ago to have a nonpartisan commission work on our redistricting process. Can you talk about how we kind of got to that point and how this is differed from what we've done in the past in Virginia?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way it used to be in the past was that whoever had power in Richmond, whoever controlled the General Assembly and the governor, together they would pass the new redistricting maps. And in the 1990s, the Democrats controlled redistricting, and they used redistricting to try to hurt the Republicans. And then in the 2000s, the Republicans and Democrats shared power. But then in the 2010, Republicans had an upper hand, and they used their power to draw gerrymanders that actually diluted the voting power of Black Virginians in central and southeastern Virginia. So this has been like this whiplash the last 30 years of whoever happens to be in control gets to use this tool to punish the other party. And so sort of a unique opportunity in Virginia, it's really, really hard to change how you redistrict because it's baked into the Constitution. But this reform movement gained momentum at the perfect time, and it resulted in the General Assembly voluntarily giving away its power to create this new reform. And it's actually the way that it works is that Democrats and Republicans share power on the redistricting committee, along with citizens who are nominated by each party. And that's the commission that we had. We rolled it out last year, the first time. And what happened? They basically couldn't agree on anything. Republicans were on one side and Democrats were on the other side. It's probably pretty predictable that it would happen that way. But the reforms were much bigger than just creating a commission. They said that if the commission doesn't come up with a plan, then the Supreme Court of Virginia will come up with a plan. And that's what happened in our case. The commission couldn't agree on anything. The Republicans wanted to draw a map that gave their party an advantage, and the Democrats wanted to draw a map that gave their party an advantage. So it went to the Supreme Court. And actually, the Supreme Court drew plans that aren't necessarily perfect. Everybody has a different idea of what's perfection, but it's not terribly unfair. It's actually not so bad. So in some ways, the reforms were successful because we didn't get obvious gerrymandering for the first time in like 30 years. So that's how it unfolded. And the story behind the reforms is pretty remarkable, given that it's like really, really hard to amend the Virginia Constitution. And that never before in the history of our country has a state legislature voluntarily given away its power to draw the district line. So it's pretty remarkable that it even happened here.
Thank you for going into the process. Can you talk a little more about what it actually looked like? So, you mentioned that they picked people who had kind of different partisan leanings to make up the commission. Can you talk more about, I know there were legislators on the commission, there were citizen members. Yeah. Can you talk more about that process and any additional public meetings they may have had?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the gold standard of drawing fair district maps is having a committee of non-politicians draw the maps. So my research, I looked at how states across the country draw their district maps and what happens. And the worst abuses happen when like one political party gets to do everything without having to have anyone else's input, basically cram it down their throats. That's like the worst outcome. And the best outcome is when normal citizens, sort of like jury duty, where you just select a group of normal citizens and you put them in a room. They managed to draw fair district maps. It's pretty remarkable. They don't even have to be like experts at redistricting, but they know their own community and they know what fairness is. And so those are the best. And what we did in Virginia was somewhere in between. So the design is that we chose for the commission was a hybrid. The politicians in the General Assembly, they recognize that redistricting is killing everybody. It's terrible because it hurts Democrats when Republicans are in charge, and it hurts Republicans when Democrats were in charge. So like we had this narrow window where both parties kind of agreed, we'll let a committee do the job. But they didn't want to completely relinquish power. And so the way they designed the committee was that like it would have 16 seats, and half of those seats will go to politicians in the General Assembly. And so 2 members from each house from each party. So that means the commission includes 2 Republicans in the House, 2 Democrats in the House, 2 Republicans in the Senate, and 2 Democrats in the Senate. And then what happens is the rest of the 8 are filled by normal people. And the way they find the people is the leaders in the General Assembly. The Republicans come up with a list of candidates and the Democrats come up with a list of candidates. And then a group of judges selects the best people, or a group of retired judges. It's actually really interesting because that the way that they find the citizens is similar to how other states do it. But the judges actually did a really good job in selecting who they would come up with. What happened is each party gets to select a list of names, and then the judges pick who's going to be on the citizen commission. And what ended up happening was we had 8 citizens, 4 from each party. And what happened with the commission is it just broke down into partisan camps. And if you think about it, it's kind of like it's kind of not really a level playing field. If you have 4 politicians for each party, and then you have 4 citizens who are nominated by each party, and you put them in a room, the power dynamics aren't really that fair. I mean, politicians are thinking about this from a completely different perspective, but the citizens themselves, maybe they're more sort of aligned to a political party, and it's really hard. So what happened is we didn't see any momentum at all, and the committee just broke down, and there was never really any real attempt to try to come to an agreement, unfortunately.
So the next time we go through the redistricting process, will it operate the same way?
Yes, it will. And one of the things that is good that happened in the last days before redistricting was that the Democrats, along with some Republicans, came up with a list of rules to try to make sure that the committee would have to achieve certain things. So those rules were in place last round, and they'll be in place in 2031 when the next districts are drawn. But we're probably going to repeat the same thing that we did last year, which is the commission won't pass anything because it's designed in a way that it's really hard to come and compromise when you have politicians sitting in the committee itself. And so what happened this round was that the Supreme Court of Virginia got to pick the lines, and they asked each party to come up with some experts who could draw the map, and they found 2 people who could work together and actually produce the maps that we have today. I'm guessing that would probably happen in 2031 unless we have a dramatic cultural shift in the way that we do politics in the United States.
So there have been a lot of conversations about whether we're going to have House of Delegate elections this year. We obviously have our congressional midterm elections for federal elections, but can you talk about the process and where we are in determining whether we will have House of Delegate elections this year?
Yeah, so in Virginia, we're one of 5 states that has House of Delegate or state legislative elections in years ending in odd numbers. So like we had an election last year, 2021. And what happened is because the census was delayed, in part because of the coronavirus pandemic, what happened is that the data that the states need about who lives where, it wasn't delivered until late in the year. And that meant that in Virginia, we have an election coming right up we didn't have enough time to draw maps and approve maps before the state legislative elections took place. And so there's some lawsuits in the courts right now arguing that we need to have a new election immediately, ideally this year, to fill the seats in the new maps. But as far as I can recall, that's never happened. And it's kind of like a long shot lawsuit to try to create an election when that's not normally how we do it. So probably we won't have an election this year, not for state legislative elections, but we will have one next year either way. And so that'll be the first year under the new maps that we just approved.
So many districts obviously have changed due to redistricting. Can you tell us anything about how historically redistricting has changed how policy is operated in Virginia?
That's a great question, and it has huge effects on policy. One of the things that we see when in terms of redistricting is it's really depends on who's in charge, how it affects policy. When politicians are in charge, they carve up the state in a way that serves their political party's interests. And what that means is that they draw communities that help elect members of their own party. So what we saw the last cycle when Republicans had the advantage was they carved Virginia up in a way that increased the voting power of rural white voters and people who were part of the Republican base, and illegally reduced the voting power of urban Black voters who tend to vote more towards the Democrats. What that meant was that we had elections where the Democrats won a majority of the vote, but actually lost control of the House of Delegates. So, that redistricting matters hugely because it gave the Republicans, at least for 2 years, an artificial majority in the House of Delegates. Now, this was at a time when we were debating whether to expand Medicaid so that we would, as part of the Affordable Care Act. And so the elections have consequences, and who is going to be in charge of the General Assembly, that determines the policies that we end up supporting. Now that's at the state level. In Congress, it matters as well. In Congress, it's a little bit different because you're dealing with fewer seats. Every state gets, seats in accordance to their population. In Virginia, we always have 11 seats, at least the last several decades, we've had 11 seats in Congress. But in places like Texas, where they get 2 new seats, who gets those seats? We know Texas, the reason that Texas gets new seats in the US Congress is because they have a large and rapidly growing Latina population. Yet those 2 new seats don't actually go to expanding the representation of voters from those communities. They actually go towards increasing the share of suburban and rural white voters who get to choose who goes to Congress. And that's because Republicans in Texas control redistricting. So it matters both at the state level and at the federal level. And it really can determine whose party wins, even if that party isn't popular. You see this in states like Wisconsin, where Wisconsin Republicans get 2/3 of the seat in their state legislature, even when Republicans win more than 50% of the vote. It's because it's such extreme gerrymandering. So it has a really profound impact on not only the parties that are controlling government, but the incentive for members of one party to even listen to the voters from another party. Because the way you can draw the district lines are such that a Republican gets such a comfortable majority, they don't even have to pander to Democrat voters because they don't need to. I mean, they can just completely ignore their needs. And so it's not only who's in charge, but it's how responsive the majority party is to voters from the other party as well.
And do you have any advice, any nonpartisan advice for advocates who are doing outreach in this current redistricting climate in Virginia?
I think that at least with this current redistricting, we have a level playing field. And I will make clear that I am not a member of either party. I don't affiliate with either party. I've never worked for a political party before. when I'm referencing political parties, I'm just going off of the evidence and the results of my own research. So I think that it's really hard in this climate to get bipartisan coalitions, even though your organization, the issues that you're concerned about are clearly bipartisan. The problem is that you have politicians who are elected without bipartisan support, and they don't really have much of an incentive to work across the aisle because they're going to win regardless. In Virginia, it's not as bad. And the maps that we see in Congress, I haven't looked in great detail at the state level, they tend to be much more competitive. And so it might be that you can work on talking to legislatures whose parties' platforms aren't, historically geared towards family and child care issues, or at least providing state level support for those issues. You might be able to look at some of these districts where they're a little bit more competitive and try to lobby those members, because those members know that they're going to need Republican and Democratic voters to support them. And maybe this is an issue where you can target these particular voters in these districts that are really, really competitive. So it may just be a matter of looking at the map and looking at maybe some suburban districts that are much more competitive than they used to be. And maybe they're controlled by a Republican, and trying to gain Republican support, because in the House of Delegates, there's like four, the Republicans have like a majority of like four delegates. So if you can pick up a couple of those delegates who are Republican, but they're sort of a little uneasy about their reelection chances, and target them, strategically, you might see some success. The flip side of it is that you could also try to find primary elections where Republicans are facing off against one another and support more moderate Republicans who might be willing to get on board with your agenda in these suburban districts that are sort of changing.
Do you think that redistricting in Virginia will impact the number of first-time candidates we see running, or have you in your research come across anything about that?
That's a really good question. I think so, especially this cycle, because 10 years ago, we had politicians drawing the maps, and the politicians were keenly aware about how their decisions would affect people in power. They didn't want to hurt their friends. But this time we had two court-appointed special masters who didn't really have strong ties to the political establishment, and it's going to be a lot of people losing their seats. So this next election cycle, we're going to see a lot of first-time members of the General Assembly, because the lines have been shuffled in a way without any regard to where sitting members of the General Assembly are living or what their district is. Yeah, I live here in Central Virginia and in Henrico County, and the district lines have completely changed almost for everybody. And there's like 3 or 4 members of the House of Delegates and the State Senate who are no longer living in the districts that they're currently representing. So there's going to be a complete disruption, and that's an opportunity for you all, because if you can get this issue to be something that's talked about during the election, that's an issue that Republicans and Democrats in these seats are concerned about, that they feel like they need to address as part of their campaign, then that's a win for you all.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. This has been great just to have you come on and talk about redistricting, what you've seen in your research. And just a reminder to everyone that Alex is nonpartisan. This is a nonpartisan organization and conversation, but there are obviously political realities. It's a political process, or it has been, right? So we are thankful just to get the ins and outs of that. So, I really thank you all for joining us this afternoon to talk about redistricting. We hope that you will continue, even though we know the General Assembly is set to end actually tomorrow. We know we probably will have to come back for another special session. They'll have to finish the budget. So there's a lot more to do, but we encourage you to remain active and engaged on childcare policy. So thank you all and have a great weekend.